gray aliens, and the police told you we got creatures from outer space that are doing this. You did tell us that.
Well,
but we didn't really.
Yeah, it was the first sheriff that I went to interview, Sheriff Tex Graves, up in Sterling, Colorado. I was director of special projects at the CBS station in Denver, and there were reports all over the Colorado and Wyoming and Utah, the media, and it was about headlines concerning these two words were in the headlines in September of 79 when I took notice, and they were bloodless and trackless. And I couldn't fathom, coming from a background of having produced for TV news and documentaries and studio programs on science, medicine, and the environment, how could they mean bloodless and trackless? Trackless means that the animal didn't even walk to the scene where it was, and it was that which provoked my mind, as well as some other things, to start calling sheriffs. And it was Sheriff Tex Graves in Logan County. I spent several hours looking at Polaroid photos that he had from animal mutilations from the beginning of the 70s, and I'm sitting in his place, his office, in September of 79. He had just retired from the sheriff's office, so he felt, I believe, a little more free to speak. And after I had looked at a lot of photographs in an extraordinary case that I can tell you about, he looked at me and he said, "Let me save you some time." And he knew me from all the work that I had done at the Channel 7 CBS station on science and medicine and environmental issues, and that was the context in which he was showing me his offense reports and the photographs. And when he said, "Linda, let me save you some time, the perpetrators of these animal mutilations are creatures from outer space," quote unquote. He was not the only person in law enforcement to say that to me in 79 to 80, but no one would go on the record in front of my TV camera and crew and say those words until October of 1979. The crew and I were in Raton, New Mexico. We had been traveling from ranch to ranch. We had been filming some extraordinary mutilations. We had been talking with a lot of ranchers, a couple of fellow reporters, and talking to as many law enforcement people as would at least talk with me, even if they would not stand up in front of a camera, which was most of the time. And while we were on the road, I'm making phone calls, and I learned that there have been fresh mutilations down in a place called Walsenburg, Colorado, and Raton, New Mexico, in that area. And so I called up where I think at that time it was the district attorney's office, and it was in Trinidad. And I explained that I was with a TV crew from Denver, and we were working on trying to answer the question, who or what is killing and mutilating these animals? And the answer basically was that there was so much going on concerning all of the mutilations being reported to Lou Girotto, who had been put as head of the district attorney's office and investigation of mutilations, that the only time that he could see the crew and me was at 10 o'clock the next night. So we got there with our tripod and gear and lights, and we were now in his office starting at 10 o'clock at night. And maybe it was the hour, but when I asked him the same question that I had been asking law enforcement everywhere we went, who or what is killing and mutilating these animals and why, he looked straight at me and said, "Well, other investigators and I have come to the conclusion that we are dealing with creatures from outer space." They were exactly the same words as Sheriff Tex Graves had used in our first discussion back in September. And then when I asked why, Lou Girotto in an official capacity in the DA's office investigating animal mutilations, proceeded to describe dozens of reports of people seeing what looked like helicopters in the sky that were silent, or seeing something that they thought was a helicopter that would dissolve away and disappear in the sky. And he said, we're not dealing with something that we understand. We know that it is mimicking the environment, but that we do not know precisely what it is. And in many ways, jumping to February 10th, 2015, as we're speaking live today, if you saw I have a series of shelves in my office in which I keep files on stories that I'm developing for Earth Files and for radio and television and so forth. And one of them that has gotten thicker and thicker over just the last 3 or 4 weeks has been half-cat mutilations, animal mutilations, horse mutilations. And when people say, well, animal mutilations, wasn't that something from long ago? And you realize how disconnected the general world is from current events when it comes to high strangeness. It has never stopped. It is ongoing. But unless somebody like me, who has worked in television and radio and books and all for a very long time, keeps at this and keeps reporting, the government doesn't want anybody to pay attention to animal mutilations being perpetrated by quote-unquote creatures from outer space. And so they would rather that the subject was just constantly explained as predator, disease, and satanic cults, which they tried hard to sell the public and the media on in the 70s to the 80s, but it never stuck, because this is the reason why. I've talked maybe conservatively to maybe 800, 900 ranchers in the last 35 years, and every one who has had a mutilation, they always are struck by the same thing. They are very familiar with what predators and disease do to animals. And what they're looking at, often warm to touch, meaning the rancher has gotten to the animal in their pasture within 3 or 4 hours of death. The animal is warm to touch, and yet an ear is missing, an eye is missing, the tongue is removed deep in the throat, half of the jaw or all of the jaw flesh is taken. The genitals, male or female, are excised neatly, and almost 90% of the cases, the rectum is cored out in a neat hole in females, often encompassing the vaginal tract as well. And I don't know whether it's 10% or 20% of the cases, but it is a fascinating detail. The tail is either removed right up to the base of the spine, or the tail is cut in half, and whatever was there is gone. You do not find the tails. You find this strange, glassy, shiny base to the spine where the tail was removed. And for ranchers, who this is their life, they know all of their animals very well. They recognize everything. They know very many different diseases. And when they find an animal like what I've just described to you, lying on its side in a pasture and there is not a drop of blood on any of the excisions, the bodies are warm to touch. And often in the West, the animals are found on what I call face powder dry ground. You can't walk on it. A rabbit can't hop across without leaving tracks. And yet, time after time, animals ranging up to 1,700, 1,800 pounds are on their side in powdered dust, and there is not a single track around their mutilated body. And the reason why law enforcement, that's where the term mutilation began in the 60s. The term began because of just what I've described to you. The law enforcement from the beginning knew it was dealing with something that was so strange, so bizarre, so inexplicable. Medically, it didn't make sense. And so they could say in their offense reports, these various pieces of body tissue removed from the animal. And that fell into the category of mutilation, even if the animals were dead when found. And some people have said, well, you can't officially call it a mutilation because a mutilation is on some living life form. You have to be alive to be mutilated. I think that is basically a superficial distinction, because I understand exactly why law enforcement, they always themselves wrote in their offense reports, mutilated bodies, because they were not torn up by predators. This was not the result of a disease, and the satanic cult argument never held up. No matter how many people have heard satanic cult presented in their local media as an explanation, it was just the most convenient catch-all that a lot of places used just to get the media and the public off their back. And that just gives you kind of a fast overview to start this discussion, that right from the very beginning, going as far back as the mutilations go, and I have found newspaper reports of what I've described going in the southeast and other parts of the United States as far back as 1961 to 62. And the famous case 67 was the horse in the San Luis Valley near Alamosa, Colorado. And that case is where the entire world public began. It was that horse stripped of flesh from the neck up, no blood, no tracks. In fact, the closest tracks they could find to that horse's body were 100 feet away. There were no tracks within 100 feet in any direction. And that's when law enforcement looked up at the sky and said, whatever did this, it had to lower this horse to the ground. And that we have found for ever since that I started investigating as director of special projects at the CBS station in Denver. That was the one thing that in addition to the bloodlessness, was the fact that there were no tracks, and that many of the animals, when they were subjected to any kind of necropsy, the veterinarians that did do necropsies, which are expensive, and that's why they aren't done very often, that there were broken bones, especially in the hip and the back area, meaning the animals had been dropped from a height to the ground. And I personally have covered so many cases like that. I have done television documentaries in Canada and Montana and Nebraska and Colorado and many places where exactly the same thing. The animals have clearly been dropped to the ground. Not only are there broken bones, but these bloodless, trackless animals are lying in small craters caused by the impact of their own body on the ground. And so for our discussion today, on February 10th, 2015, for you to know that what I've been laying out is the backstory on this worldwide phenomena since the 60s, and that today, in 2015, as we're going forward, there are brand new cases of mutilated animals coming to my office now on a regular basis.
Thanks. And one of the more inauspicious things that you said in one of your interviews was, someone told you, Linda, we're looking at a genetic harvest, and you thought, well, if we're looking at a genetic harvest, then what kind of a genetic harvest, and to what end? Well, just for the hell of it, I ask, what kind of a genetic harvest and to what end? If someone asks you, can you come up with a possible answer to that question, can you give one?
Well, I think in the last, probably since 2010, a whole new area of we'll call it the UFO extraterrestrial phenomena, just because it continues to become more and more complicated, but those are buzzwords that everybody understands. That a whole new area began emerging with tremendous details, allegedly from whistleblowers beginning around 2010, concerning the concepts of hybrids and what's called rapid cycle cloning by extraterrestrials. And there are two books that probably have the most details of anything on the planet. One is called Rachel's Eyes. The other is called UFO Highway. The author of Rachel's Eyes, co-authors, are Jean Bilodeau, a reporter in Cedarville, California, and Helen Luttrell. And I'm going to talk to you about Helen Luttrell in a little more detail in just a moment. But the second book, UFO Highway, is written by a computer tech guy named Anthony Sanchez. What is interesting is that both books are about in-depth details, allegedly from U.S. Air Force whistleblowers, who were both colonels. Neither author knew anything about the other person's book. It was in my work two people even began to learn about each other. They still have not read each other's books yet. They're in the process of trying to get their books. And I'm stressing that to say these are two completely different backgrounds, cases, events, timelines, and yet the stories are remarkably similar. And the bottom line of it is Helen Luttrell was the mother of a young college student girl at American River College in Sacramento who was blind. And the daughter had been blind by childhood diabetes. And so the entrance into this college was a challenge to the mother and to the daughter to see if the daughter could do it, if she could survive. She wanted to try to go to college as a blind person and get a degree. That was her dream in life. So her mother made it possible, Helen Luttrell, for her blind daughter to enter this college in Sacramento, where the mother, Helen Luttrell, worked at Mathers Air Force Base there in Sacramento and had been working there for a long time. She had moved her daughter into an apartment and entered her daughter in the college, and the college was willing to try to help, when a U.S. Air Force colonel came to the college and said that he had a daughter with disabilities and wondered if there was another student who might have disabilities that they could roommate together, and that he, the U.S. Air Force colonel, would help in all that was needed to keep these roommates going. And the timeline was so close upon Helen being able to get her blind daughter into the school that she always thinks that everything was being monitored and that they were looking, government, NSA, CIA, DIA, that group, now represented in this discussion as a U.S. Air Force colonel, that they were looking for opportunities in which to introduce an extraterrestrial human hybrid in some sort of a situation where the hybrid could learn from humans without being found out. And a blind person would be a perfect combination. And the assignment from the college tells or sets up this meeting. The money and everything is arranged, and now the daughter who is blind and the daughter of the colonel are now roommates. The blind girl just told Helen that she had a new roommate, very quiet, no bother, except that she had something that she put in the refrigerator to eat only once or twice a day, and the blind girl didn't understand, but that it was liquid. That was all that Helen knew. And within 2 or 3 weeks of her daughter moving into this apartment and then having this quick assignment of the other girl, Helen went over to meet her. And it was one of those, the way life often is, you can't plan things. Things just seem to stumble together. Helen was coming up the stairs toward her daughter's apartment when her daughter was coming out of the apartment, met her mother at the top of the stairs, and her mother said, I came over to meet Rachel, the name of the roommate, and that her daughter said, oh, well, she is just getting ready to leave. Just wait a minute, and she'll come out. And Helen said, a girl that she sketched in the book, anybody who reads Rachel's Eyes will see this illustration, which interestingly enough, some of us who have done interviews and investigated with other people in the abduction syndrome, we have seen exactly this type before, now defined as an extraterrestrial human hybrid by this colonel eventually. And as this girl is coming toward them, Helen is realizing that she's very, very abnormal looking, with odd reddish hair, wearing very large glasses, dark glasses, is wearing a coat in a day where everybody else is not wearing coats and it's warm. And as Rachel comes forward and her daughter begins to reach out to say, I want to introduce you to my mother, the girl in the coat and the dark glasses trips on a mat that is on the walk coming from the apartment and begins tipping forward and has a whole lot of books in her arm. And Helen said, you know, if it were a human, they would automatically drop the books and reach out because she was going forward. Her body was going forward to the ground. And she said, I realized she's going to hit the ground, and I reached out and grabbed a hold of her arm. And she said, when I touched the skin that was out on her arm, she said, Linda, it wasn't human skin. I don't know what to describe it except that it was soft, there was no bone, and it felt a little bit like rubber. And she said, I realized that I better keep holding her or she's really going to fall to the ground, so I'm hanging on to her arm, and her glasses fell off. And Helen said I was no more than 8 or 10 inches from my eyes to her eyes at that moment, and I was looking at the color of the inside of an avocado, if you know what I mean. It's the light green, not the dark green skin. We're talking about the what's called the flesh of the avocado near the pit, a light green, and that in the middle of each solid, there were no whites, solid light green eyes were vertical black pupils. And Helen said, it scared me. I jerked back, helping her stand up, and she knew that I saw her. But instead of stopping, she just kept going down the stairs, and she said, that's how I met the hybrid. And the whole story unfolds in Rachel's eyes about this event occurring and the daughter and the mother talking, and that I think that they made a call someplace, and the Air Force colonel set up an appointment to come to talk with both of them and explained that he had been working in what was called a hybridization program for the United States government since the 1950s. Now, there are a lot of people who have never been exposed to any level of any of this, to which this must sound like science fiction. But when you go to the UFO Highway book, written approximately, both of these books were written approximately at the same time, independently from two different sources, you are introduced again to a hybridization program, but not at Area 51, which is where the U.S. Air Force colonel in the, we'll call it the Sacramento hybrid case. This other is a U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel also working in a hybridization program from the 1950s, but in the Dulce, New Mexico area. And when you read the two books and you look at the details and you understand what are given as the reasons for complete secrecy, the highest classified subject in the world from the United States point of view, and you boil it all down, you have to read all of these books to really get an appreciation for the details, but this is what it comes down to that I think personally is perhaps part of this complicated phenomena. And Andrew, it is this, that we may be dealing with other life in the universe and that it may be trying to survive as we try to survive on Earth. And that if there is a hybridization program that has been ongoing underground on this planet for a long time, and it involves the harvest of genetic material from animals, humans, and plants on the surface, it may be that we are dealing with a story that actually is not so much frightening as it is sad, and that if humans were in a position where we were desperate to keep our DNA surviving and evolving, but something was hurting us, and we knew our civilization was dying out because DNA would no longer replicate, what would humans do? How far would humans go to perpetuate their civilization? And there is some aspect to some of this that seems to fall into that category. And I'm not pretending to have all the answers, but I'm trying to give you the biggest picture possible because we have such a short period of time to discuss this, that we may be dealing with phenomena so complex that it literally has to do with the survival of a civilization that would go completely extinct in the cosmos if it were not able to harvest genetic material from Earth life or other planetary life.
Yeah, I do seem to recall Alex Collier in one of his talks in the 90s talking about a group of greys, I believe it was Zeta Greys, that their species is dying off and they need to do some genetic harvesting. I don't think it was cattle mutilations or animal mutilations. I believe it had to do with humans. But make of that whatever you will. But I would like to switch gears here and go to the Rendlesham Forest incident because you've done a lot of work on that and a recent documentary on UFO TV YouTube channel, Top 10 UFO Whistleblowers of All Time. One of the people on the list was one of the guys involved with the Rendlesham Forest incident. Why don't you, in about, I'd say, try 12 minutes, because I'd like to talk about skulls later on, tell us the Rendlesham Forest incident, what's that all about?
Well, for those who might not be familiar, December 26th to 28th, 1980, spanning 72 hours, the RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge Complex in Woodbridge, England. It was, at the time, in 1980, the largest single NATO air base that we had. And England and the United States were the closest of allies coming out of World War II in 45 on. And so it was natural that the largest NATO base in Europe would be a combination of American and UK. And about midnight, there was a call that went, apparently there had been several calls, but it involved Central Security Control and getting in touch with an area of the base called the Eastgate area that was near a forest called Rendlesham. And some people had seen some strange colored lights. They referred to them as it looked like Christmas tree lights moving in the forest. Now, I've been in that forest with John Burroughs and Jim Penniston and the Ancient Aliens production crew, trying to go back to exactly the site that the three men who first entered the forest to find out those lights, could they find that spot 33 years later? And having been there, and what a vast, thick forest it is, and realizing that the description of the colored lights that was going to this big NATO base were that there were these colored Christmas-looking lights moving around in the forest, and when you're in that forest, and a lot of those trees are growing no more than 3 or 4 feet, trunk to trunk, it is that thick in some places, you think, what? How could colored lights be moving around in the forest? And Jim Peniston was the staff sergeant on duty that night. Airman, which is he had been there only for about a year, Airman First Class John Burroughs and Airman Ed Kovansak, those were the two new young guys. They get selected or volunteer themselves or something to go into the forest with Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston, who has a reputation at RAF Bentwaters to investigate any kind of air crashes, and always carried a notebook and always made notes and sketches when he was at air sites, so he wouldn't be depending upon his memory only to fill out forms. And they get in it was like a pickup truck, and they take off to try to find these lights. And they stop at a particular place in the forest on a road, and they are seeing colored lights. And Jim Peniston, who is a senior in rank, tells Ed Kovansak, the youngest and newest airman, to stay with the truck, and that he and Airman First Class John Burroughs will start into the forest with their radios, keeping in coordination and communication with Ed Kovansak in the truck, with the control group off on the base away from where they are, and that they know that they are walking onto UK citizen land. Rendlesham Forest is not military land. It is UK public land, and they have to be extremely aware. They had to get permission to do that, and the order was they would not take any guns with them because they were entering civilian land. And as they start walking toward these lights, whatever was occurring, the lights started moving away from them, and they start running, and I was in that forest with an Ancient Alien segment where they started duplicating what it was that they remembered doing back on December 26, 1980. And the thing that impressed all of us was you can't run in that forest without falling down. And they did fall down. They remembered trying to run and fall down and run and fall down, and they're trying to go after these lights. And then a whole bunch of things seem to happen all at once. Central Security Control loses all radio contact with everybody in the forest. Ed Kovansak is at the truck, and he's always been so afraid since that night that he won't talk to anybody. Jim and John have two completely different memories of what happens next. John doesn't really remember much of anything immediately. Peniston remembers a huge white blast of light, like everything went white. And then there is a black, glassy triangle craft about 9 feet long and 7 feet high, and he sees that it has symbols in the front, and Peniston has no idea where Burroughs is. He doesn't see Burroughs. He doesn't remember Burroughs. But he walks around, gets out his notebook, walks around this glassy black triangle, now just appeared out of this blast of white light. Now, he doesn't know if it's sitting, landed, hovering on a column of light. He sees light underneath it, but he doesn't know what's there, and it's not moving. And when he puts his fingers on it, it is warmer than the cold December winter air. And he starts walking around, dragging his fingers all around this triangular craft until he gets to the symbols that he compared to feeling something he would imagine would be like Braille, and later drew these and put them in his notebook. And when it was all over, the two men, Burroughs and Peniston, have memories that join ultimately in both standing and watching a white light taking off at treetop level and moving rather slowly and then more quickly. And John Burroughs doesn't remember anything except that he was gone, and then they learned that Central Security Control lost all radio communication with him for 45 minutes. So technically, it was 45 minutes of missing time. And the next night, the 27th, a whole series of many more complicated phenomena occurred. And on the 28th is when the base commander, Connor, the deputy base commander, Charles Halt, and about 15 other men were ordered to go back into the forest where lights had been reported each of those nights, including the night of the 28th, and they were to take light-alls for light. They were to take cameras, both to videotape and do still photographs. They took Geiger counters to check for radioactivity. They found a tripod indented in the ground in the forest, which had to have been the place where Peniston said a triangular-shaped craft appeared, and he didn't know what it was on because there was only light, but they found a tripod. And when they put the Geiger counter into each of those three holes in the ground in the forest, they had background in gamma and other areas of radiation. And all of that was reported, and this whole group went out there with the idea that they would stay out in the forest and see what would happen with the lights and do these measurements. And not only did lights reappear, John Burroughs reappears at the scene, but Colonel Halt told me firsthand in a recorded interview that I have had at my news website, earthfiles.com, on Coast to Coast AM radio and Dreamland online, that as he was with all of these men in that area where the tripod marks were sunk into the ground, that they could see beams that looked like laser beams, but they were all white, coming out of a large white glowing object above the trees. And the beams were coming down into the forest, and suddenly at one point, Colonel Halt, who is leading these men, trying to understand what it is that is interacting with Rendlesham Forest and potentially with the largest NATO Air Force base, has a beam come down, this is from Colonel Halt, 3 feet from the toes of my shoes. Colonel Halt interpreted that as aggression. Whether it was aggression or curiosity or demonstration, who knows? He interpreted it as aggression. And when the beam came down that close to his shoes, everything about what was going on in Bentwaters went to another level. And today, in 2015, all of those people who were there during those 72 hours are, I think, to a person, they've never forgotten where they were, what they did, what they saw, what they felt. And of all of the people at RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge, who is the most frustrated because he can't break through, is John Burroughs. And John Burroughs is the only person in the RAF Bentwaters saga who, by his by the men around him on the night of the 26th and the night of the 28th, say that they had information that he might have been taken by this craft in the first night, and in the third night on the 28th, one of the eyewitnesses there said they saw a red-orange light come down and engulf John Burroughs, and that he rose up in the light. And yet John cannot remember anything after half a dozen hypnosis sessions to this day. But the piece of hard evidence that something extraordinary happened to John Burroughs is that when he developed heart disease, he's only in his early 50s now and began developing heart disease 3 or 4 years ago, serious heart disease. When he, and he's a military guy with a service record in the Air Force for quite a while, when he went to the Veterans Administration in Phoenix, he was told eventually, after many runarounds, that he could not have access to his 1980 to 84 medical records at RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge because they were classified. And there has been a huge effort by him and working with other people to try to understand why that would be, and what is, if there is any connection to his heart damage or so forth. He ended up having major heart surgery in the last 12, 14 months. He's doing much better now. But the mystery of RAF Bentwaters is, to me, the single most important of all of the phenomena cases, because it involves so many military people working on a base that was the largest NATO base in 1980, and that both sides of the base, the UK and the American, we now know, both had nuclear weapons underground. Did that have anything to do with why the interest of whatever was controlling the black glassy triangle with the symbols on it? And to cap it all, Jim Penniston showed John Burroughs, me, and the producers of the Ancient Aliens program when we were working together for a television segment, a notebook that had a lot of zeros and ones in the back. John Burroughs said he'd never seen it before. I had never seen it before. Nobody. And Jim Penniston said, I know, I never told anyone. John, I never even told you back then. He said, once I touched the black and white glassy craft, zeros and ones came vividly into my mind. They were driving me crazy. We left. I went home. I thought they would go away. They stayed to the next day on the 27th, and I thought I was going mad, and something then entered my mind and said, sit down and write down these zeros and ones, and he put them in that same notebook that he used to sketch the triangle and other things in the forest. And once he had written down the zeros and ones, he said suddenly his mind went completely still, completely blank, no more binary code, and that he sat on that until we were working with the Ancient Aliens people around 2010. Now, all of that, I've done immense amounts of reporting at earthfiles.com showing the binary code, showing the translations, and eventually some of it was translated into latitudes and longitudes that are not clear about their relationship to each other, but suggest that whatever it was in that forest may have been sending and receiving information, and that it translated into the Penniston human mind as binary code, because that kind of 0 and 1 math should be understandable throughout the entire huge universe, and that those zeros and ones included information on latitudes and longitudes, which, if this were an extraterrestrial time machine, which is what Jim Penniston thinks, or a drone of some sort, not piloted, its whole job may have been to be moving around to various points uploading latitude, longitudes, downloading latitude, longitudes for assignments that no one understands. But Jim Penniston said that the one thing that came across to him clearly was that time travelers from far in the future were responsible for the lights and the events in Rendlesham near RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge, and that the reason that they were here is because their civilization was dying out, and they were coming back to get genetic material to use as, quote, Band-Aids, close quote, to buy time while they were trying to repair the problem so that they could survive. And that's shades of what we talked about in the first half hour.
Okay, thanks. And just quickly, a couple of minutes, want to cover the latitude and the longitude. It was said on episode of Ancient Aliens, if you latitude and longitude, those coordinates, it goes to the lost civilization of High Brazil. Could you maybe
No.
2 minutes?
No. Everybody is got this completely screwy. There were about a dozen latitudes and longitudes. One, the scientists I was working with on the binary translation versus a computer person in Los Angeles working with Ancient Aliens, they came to different conclusions about the binary code, and this is so important for everybody listening to remember. There was no indication in any of the strings of zeros and ones in Penniston's notebook, which I've seen with my own eyes, that would indicate minutes, seconds, or hours. It just means that the teams trying to take the endless zeros and ones and see if they could make it work in ASCII code of various 7 or 8 0 and 1 groups could come up with anything that would relate to something they could understand. And eventually, these different teams trying to work on these strings of zeros and ones came up with different options. And in fact, I did an Earth File story with a astrophysicist who became interested in this. And he broke down all permutations. And the truth is, you take that string of zeros and ones and you break it down into all the possibilities that you can have in hours, minutes, and seconds, depending upon where you place the decimal points and the latitude, longitudinal options on the Earth, and you come up with a tremendous number of options per, we'll call it per latitude, longitude code. And therefore, when it came to the one of many latitudes and longitudes, Ancient Aliens decided that they would go in their TV production with High Brazil, something mythological, never known to exist, that was supposed to have been off the west coast of Ireland. My scientists, the astrophysicist included, they said that the latitude, longitude in their reworkings, and they worked on it hard, was right at the town hall center of Woodbridge. And most people think that that makes a lot of sense. If you're dealing with machines that are self-activating software for self-activating extraterrestrial technologies, they would move around any planet or moon or anything by orientation in latitude, longitude, and in this Earth, its magnetic fields. So to this day, there has never been a consensus on the one of many latitude, longitudes that you could get out of the binary code. Ours saying the center of Woodbridge town, and Ancient Aliens placing it High Brazil, a completely mythological, like a philosophical concept west of Ireland.
Okay, thank you. By the way, just so everybody knows, the live feed for the show will be going off in exactly 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Linda, I could give you a little more time. than that, of course, because we can still continue the show a little bit after that to get the important stuff about the skulls, because I wanted to talk about that, because I saw an interview where you talked about the elongated skulls. I believe you said you did speak to Zachariah Sitch, and I have on some previous shows talked about how I know he was accurate. He was not a fraud. He was not a disinfo agent. Don't believe any of that stuff. I've debunked all that, and I also explained how the Anunnaki can survive on Nibiru, even though it's so far from the sun.
Zechariah.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I knew Zechariah from the early 1980s on, and he was fascinating, and I think he was trying to report as who knows, maybe he was being paid by the CIA to do the work. But the Anunnaki from history, the depiction of the Anunnaki, this is not some buzzword picked up out of the web today. The Anunnaki is carved in stone that is 5,000 years old from Mesopotamia. And the Anunnaki were depicted as having large cone-shaped heads. The Ubaid figurines that were found in Uruk and in southern Mesopotamia by the thousands and are in many, many museums around the world. They depict these odd reptilian-looking humanoids with these long cone-shaped heads and with spots that are assumed to be scales around their strange bodies. Now, if the Anunnaki were some sort of a reptilian humanoid and they had cone-shaped heads, that's what they call the ropey headdresses that wound around what were called the so-called Anunnaki gods of Enlil and Enki and on and on. If they were extraterrestrial, and that is the assumption that Zechariah had and I have and Jim Mars has and a lot, they were extraterrestrials cohabiting with Homo sapiens sapiens, that they were responsible in manipulating DNA in already evolving primates to create a variety of different standing up primates, of which we now are a model. What happened to that standing up humanoid reptilian Anunnaki? That is a very interesting question. How does it tie into the two U.S. Air Force colonels talking in great depth about hybridization programs underground by at least one possible reptilian type, and that the Paracas, P-A-R-A-C-A-S, the Paracas skulls in Peru that are in the museums there and that Brian Forrester has videotaped and talked about in conferences as being extraterrestrial, as far as I know, they may be the direct descendant remnant of the Anunnaki extraterrestrials, but no, I can't prove that. And the statement in 2014 that an anonymous DNA analysis found changes in the DNA in the Paracas skulls that would fall into the category of extraterrestrial, the sad, unfortunate thing is there has been no proof. An anonymous scientist making anonymous comments without any scientific data that can be vetted by other scientists might as well be one hand clapping in the forest. That's the problem right now in February of 2015. If the Paracas skulls are extraterrestrial related to the Anunnaki, somebody has to prove it scientifically, and it has to be vetted by other scientists. Otherwise, we're talking about something that is fascinating, exists in museums, and to the best of my knowledge, no one in the public, government probably knows, no one in the public has proved yet exactly what the DNA is in those Paracas skulls.
Okay, I want to quickly cover the subject because you mentioned reptilians. Zachariah Sitch, in his books, he did not mention much of a reptilian or a serpent species from ancient Sumeria, but David Icke did, and it is my understanding that David Icke has been duped into thinking that the Anunnaki were reptilian aliens by someone who told him, who misled him that Zachariah Sitchin was a fraud. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that, but the point is the Anunnaki and the reptilian aliens from the research shows, they were not one and the same. They were, the Anunnaki were human-like, very large human-like from Nibiru, as Zachariah Sitchin said, and then there was the reptilian aliens of David Icke lore and such, and they did interbreed and work with each other. And I remember in that interview you saying, I don't really want to use the word Illuminati too much in my work, but you did mention it, and you said, well, maybe there is some connection there. So I thought I want to point that out. Do you think maybe there was some interbreeding between?
I have no idea. The one thing in my public work, and I think you would find this over 35 years, I'm very careful to report publicly only things that I have multiple eyewitnesses or hard physical evidence for. If we're talking about, hypothetically, in a radio discussion, could there be any relationship between the Anunnaki, reptilian humanoids, Paracas skulls, and that's the context of a discussion? We're in complete speculation, which is the point I just made. There's absolutely no DNA repeatable, supportable evidence. But jumping to Zechariah, who I did know and talked about this at great length, and the evidence, because that's what Zechariah called the when he was examining in the stone carved, that he was looking at language and trying to translate it, which is what his books are about. And so he was just going by what was there. Okay, what is another thing that has been part of the Mesopotamian history that is physical evidence? It's the thousands, and there literally are thousands of them, and they are called Ubaid, U-B-A-I-D figurines. You can Google this. And when you look at the Ubaid figurines created 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, now modern Iran, Iraq, Syria, in southern Mesopotamia, in Ubaid area, there were all of these humanoid, standing up, alligator-looking sort of, with scales on their bodies, with these long cone head-shaped heads. And they're all like that. And the supposition that has been for a long time, not just by Zechariah Sitchin, that these were depicting something in the environment that the humans who were making them related to. And if you say, well, Shamash is just a god like Zeus is just a Greek god, well, there are all kinds of emerging pieces of data that the Greek gods were actually extraterrestrials. All of the Mesopotamian, Sumerian gods were all extraterrestrials, and that there have been cohabitations that might include Egypt and going back, and then you get to Göbekli Tepe, the oldest complicated archaeology, 12,000 years old, and I've been there, and I can say firsthand that Göbekli Tepe is one of the most foreign-feeling, weird sites I've ever been, and I've been to a lot of them on this planet, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if we had some sort of a time machine and we could see how it was built and for whom. It wouldn't surprise me if it was for some extraterrestrial agenda that's incomprehensible and it was terraforming on this planet. The problem is proof. We have no proof. That's what the governments delight in. They know that the governments know that they have kept the public and the media on purpose, deliberately away from all of the hard facts and evidence that we all would like since World War II, when they realized that they were dealing with extraterrestrial biological entities. That phrase is in their own documents. And so we are on a planet that is disconnected, concocted. The public and the media are in one world. The 1%ers controlling the barter system, along with governments, are in another world. And right now, the ability to use counterintelligence to muddy the waters on the facts is what keeps those two populations divided. So I'll ask you, do you think that you see any possibility that the government by itself, on its own volition, is going to tell the truth in the next 5 years? Or will it be some action on the part of an intelligence out there that has decided that humanity deserves the truth?
Well, the government is not going to release information because, as you said in that interview, I remember you talking about this, society would fall apart from a standpoint of beliefs, religions, and, of course, if the ETs showed themselves, there's probably going to be chaos in the streets, war of the worlds.
Well, that's what the government argues, Andrew. That's what the government argues. I don't think that will happen. I've never thought that would happen. I've always argued the opposite. I think that there are more humans on Earth. Historically, India has always had Krishna and the universe full of life, always, going way back into the Upanishads and the Vedas, always. Extraterrestrials, other life in the universe has always been a part of that huge continent system. If you go to the Mormon, everything is about extraterrestrials and the recycling of life through containers. That's what the Mormon religion is based on. If you go to even some aspects of Islam, the idea that the soul goes on into other dimensions, then you are sort of even in this area of other life and other dimensions in the universe. So, and recently in the last, 10 years, the Catholic philosophy, the Catholic Church, has embraced the concept that other life forms in the universe enhance the divine field, enhance the Godhead, and do not detract. So that is changing, even for the Catholics. So I never have thought that if the government just stood up and said, here's the truth, we're not alone, never have been, extraterrestrial biological entities of all shapes, sizes, with different agendas and different solar systems and different galaxies, they're all there. And there's nothing to be afraid of that we know. And we need to get on with the business of learning how to share technologies, share products, and join, as Stanton Friedman has also said for decades, join the galactic neighborhood. That has been the perspective that I have had, that Stanton Friedman has had, that Jim Marrs has had, and that we really do feel the truth would strengthen the planet and maybe lessen the wars, not make it worse.
Yeah, well, if consciousness rises, then people are going to be more tolerant of accepting aliens, and there isn't going to be chaos in the streets. I do acknowledge that that could very well happen in the near future. So, Linda, with that being said, I will be bringing this show to a close. I thank you very much for coming back for a second hour. And since I mentioned you coming back, well, that ties into what I'm going to tell you now. I'm going to tell you the same thing I tell all of my guests. It's very emotional to tell my guests this, but yet it's got to be done because I'm on a mission. As I told you in my first interview, one of my goals with this show is to get as many different guests on my show as possible before I give any one specific guest double dips. I gave you double dips because you didn't get a second hour the first time, but I do regret to tell you that I, in all likelihood, probably won't be asking you to come on again, but that's only because I need to give thousands of other fascinating individuals a chance at some glory on my show. But